The idea to visit the old hospital had seemed thrilling at first, like something out of a ghost hunting show. It was one of those local legends people pass down. A hospital left to rot on the edge of town, abandoned since the late 80s after a mysterious fire. It wasn't the sort of place you went alone, though. And that's exactly why we decided to go together, safety in numbers, right? We arrived just after sunset, the last hints of light clinging to the horizon, casting an eerie glow over the crumbling building. The walls, once bright white, were now faded and cracked, overtaken by vines and graffiti. Windows were shattered, their jagged edges jutting out like teeth in a wicked grin. As we stood there, sizing up the place, an unsettling silence settled over us, as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting. No one wanted to be the first to say it, but I could see the doubt in everyone's eyes. It wasn't fear exactly, but that feeling that creeps into your mind when something doesn't feel quite right. Mark, the one who'd pushed us to come here in the first place, cleared his throat, trying to shake off the tension. "Come on, guys. It's just an old building." He laughed, but it sounded hollow. We all knew this place had a history, and not the kind you'd share around a campfire. Stepping inside felt like crossing an invisible threshold. The temperature dropped, and a musty, decaying smell filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of something metallic. Dust hung in thick, stagnant clouds, illuminated by our flashlights as we moved slowly down the main corridor. Each step echoed, loud and jarring in the oppressive silence. The building stretched out in front of us, an endless maze of rooms and twisting hallways. Some doors were closed tight, while others hung off their hinges, creaking softly, as though they were breathing. Mark led the way, his footsteps quick and confident, but I could tell he was as nervous as the rest of us. Sarah and Mike stayed close, their eyes darting to every shadow and flicker of movement. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something was watching, just out of sight. We passed old examination rooms, their walls peeling and stained, each one a relic of the hospital's past life. Beds lay overturned, their rusted frames a dull brown under the beams of our flashlights. Cabinets were thrown open, their contents spilled onto the floor, as if someone had left in a hurry. Here and there, broken equipment lay strewn across the ground, wires coiled like snakes ready to strike. Every few feet, a gust of wind would whistle through the broken windows, making us jump, and somewhere in the distance, something banged, a door, maybe, or a piece of equipment falling. Mark shrugged it off, calling it just the wind, but we all felt it, that tingling at the base of our necks. The place was more than just an abandoned building. It felt alive somehow, as if it had absorbed all the pain and suffering that had passed through its walls. We stopped in front of a closed door marked pediatric ward. The words were faded, barely visible under layers of grime, but there was something unsettling about them. For a moment, no one spoke. It was like the building itself didn't want us to go any further. I glanced at Sarah, who looked as uneasy as I felt. But Mark was already reaching for the handle. The door groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a narrow hallway lined with small rooms, each one dim and shadowed. Children's beds, much smaller than the ones we'd seen before, were still in place, draped in tattered sheets. A few toys lay scattered across the floor, a stuffed bear missing an eye, a small plastic truck, a broken doll. The sight of them filled me with an unexpected sadness, as if we were intruding on something that should have been left undisturbed. And that's when I heard it, the faintest sound like someone whispering. At first, I thought it was one of the others, maybe Mark making some lame attempt to spook us. But when I looked around, I saw that everyone else had heard it too. We stood there frozen listening. The whisper was too soft to make out the words, but it was there, coming from somewhere deeper in the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark scoffed, trying to brush it off. "It's probably just the wind through the pipes or something. This place is ancient." But there was no denying the fear creeping into his eyes. We all knew it wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something watching us, waiting for us to make the next move. The deeper we moved into the hospital, the heavier the air felt, thick with an eerie, almost tangible silence that seemed to press down on us. No one dared to speak, not after hearing that whisper back in the pediatric ward. It had been too real, too close. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something or someone standing in the shadows, watching us. But all I saw was darkness, an endless corridor that seemed to swallow any light we shone on it. Mark led the way, trying to keep up his fearless act, but his shoulders were tense, and he clutched his flashlight a little too tightly. Sarah walked beside him, her gaze flicking nervously from one side of the hallway to the other, as though she were trying to catch something in her peripheral vision. Mike and I brought up the rear, and I could feel his grip tighten around my arm each time something creaked or groaned in the distance. We turned a corner and found ourselves in another hallway, lined with doors. Each door had a small glass window set into it, though most were cracked or completely shattered, creating jagged, dark openings that looked almost like eyes. Inside, I could just make out empty beds and scattered remnants of the past. For stands, overturned chairs, papers littered across the floor. It was as if whoever had been here had left in a hurry, abandoning everything. As we passed one of the rooms, Sarah suddenly stopped, her flashlight frozen on the cracked window of a door. Her face went pale, and she took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Mark immediately turned his flashlight toward the room, and the rest of us followed, straining to see what had spooked her. But there was nothing, just the same empty bed, the same scattered papers, the same chilling silence. "What did you see?" Mark asked, his tone a mix of frustration and nervousness. He was trying to keep it together, but I could tell he was on edge just like the rest of us. "I don't know," Sarah stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was just a shadow, I think. But it moved, like it was watching us." Mike scoffed, trying to brush it off. "It's probably just our own shadows playing tricks on us. Look, the lights bounce off the walls weird in here. It's nothing." But even as he said it, his eyes lingered on the empty room a second too long, as if he were hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever Sarah had seen. There was an uneasy pause, each of us silently acknowledging that we'd all felt something strange since stepping into this place. Something wasn't right, and the more we moved through the building, the more certain I became that we weren't alone. We kept walking, each step slower than the last. The silence grew deeper, pressing against our ears until it felt like we were underwater. Occasionally, we'd hear faint creaks or soft whispers that seemed to come from just around the corner, but each time we looked, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself it was all in our heads, that our own imaginations were amplifying every sound, every shadow. But a part of me knew better. There was something wrong with this place, something that didn't want us there. As we reached the end of the hallway, we came to a set of double doors, slightly ajar. Mark pushed them open, revealing what must have been the main treatment area. The room was large, with rows of patient beds separated by flimsy, torn curtains. Some of the beds were overturned, and others had dark stains on the sheets that looked too fresh to belong in a building that had been abandoned for decades. The air felt colder here, with a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. My flashlight passed over an old nurse's station in the corner, where stacks of yellowed papers and shattered glass cluttered the counter. Behind the desk, a wall-mounted clock hung crookedly, its hands frozen at 3:17. Just as I was beginning to feel suffocated by the weight of the room, we heard it, a faint sound, barely louder than a whisper, echoing from somewhere nearby. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and far too real to be a trick of the mind. They came closer, steady and rhythmic, as if someone or something was walking down the hallway toward us. Mark tensed, his flashlight aimed at the doorway we'd just come through. "Did you guys hear that?" His voice was barely a whisper, his bravado gone. We all nodded, too terrified to speak. The footsteps grew louder, each step slow and methodical, echoing against the walls. It sounded like whoever, or whatever, it was knew we were there, and was taking its time, savoring each step as it approached. "Maybe it's just another group of kids like us," Mike whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. He looked around, his eyes wide with fear, and I could see his hands trembling. The footsteps stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that was somehow even worse. We held our breath, waiting, listening, every nerve in our bodies taut with anticipation. And then from somewhere down the hallway, we heard it, a faint, breathy whisper. It was too quiet to make out the words, but there was a strange, mocking tone to it, like someone was enjoying our fear. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but something held me there, rooted to the spot. My friends looked just as paralyzed, our faces pale and our bodies tense. For a few agonizing moments, there was nothing but silence. And then, slowly, the footsteps began again, echoing softly as they faded into the distance, leaving us standing there, frozen, in the heart of the abandoned hospital. The eerie silence wrapped around us like a shroud, thick and suffocating. We all stayed rooted to the spot, each of us processing what we'd just experienced. The sound of footsteps in an abandoned hospital should have been impossible, yet we'd all heard it, and that quiet, mocking whisper had confirmed our worst fears. We weren't alone here. Mark cleared his throat, but no one said anything. For a moment, we were united by the sheer weight of fear that had fallen over us, as if the walls themselves were watching. Finally, Mark broke the silence, his voice shaky but determined. "It's probably just the building settling," he muttered, but even he didn't seem convinced. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, and I could see he was beginning to regret dragging us here. Sarah grabbed his arm, her knuckles white. "This isn't just some prank, Mark. Something's wrong here." We continued down the corridor, moving as one tight, anxious group. Every step felt heavier, the oppressive weight of the building pressing down on us. Each room we passed seemed darker and colder than the last, filled with equipment that appeared oddly untouched despite the years of abandonment. Occasionally, we'd hear faint sounds, a soft rustling, a creak that seemed to follow us. But every time we turned to look, there was nothing. Just the empty hospital waiting. We reached another hallway, and at the end was a door marked records. Mark pushed it open, revealing a cramped, dimly lit room cluttered with old filing cabinets. Papers littered the floor, some faded and torn, their words barely legible. The faint smell of mildew filled the room, mingling with that ever-present metallic scent. Sarah's flashlight flickered as she scanned the scattered files, and I noticed something strange. A stack of folders on the far desk, looking as if they'd been placed there recently. As we approached the desk, my flashlight illuminated one of the open folders, revealing a black and white photo of a young child with hollow eyes and a haunted expression. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note, scrawled hastily in red ink. "They never left." My heart pounded as I glanced at the other files. Each one contained a photo and a note, some of them disturbingly specific. Locked in darkness, trapped in silence, forgotten by time. It was as if these were case files, documenting patients who had never made it out. Mike backed away, his face pale, muttering under his breath, "This place, it's wrong. We need to leave. Now." But just as he spoke, a faint, childlike giggle echoed from somewhere behind us, soft and chilling. We froze, every nerve on edge. The laugh seemed to drift through the room, as if it were coming from all around us. I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. The only things watching us were those faded black and white photos, their hollow eyes following us, almost accusing. Before anyone could react, Sarah screamed. She pointed at the far end of the room, where one of the cabinet drawers had slowly begun to slide open on its own. I could see her hands shaking as she backed away, her flashlight trembling as she tried to steady it. The drawer creaked, echoing in the confined space, until it was fully open, revealing a neatly folded hospital gown. Mark took a step forward, drawn to the strange sight. He hesitated, glancing at each of us before slowly reaching out to touch the gown. Just as his fingers brushed the fabric, the door to the records room slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the lights in the hallway flickered violently. We were plunged into near-total darkness, our flashlights barely piercing the shadows. Panic surged through me as I tried to open the door, pulling at the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. "Someone's locking us in," Mike gasped, his voice filled with terror. "This place. Someone doesn't want us to leave." Desperate, we pounded on the door, shouting, but our voices seemed to vanish into the silence. It was like the hospital had absorbed every sound, every cry for help, leaving us trapped and unheard. The giggling returned, louder this time, closer. It echoed off the walls, swirling around us, blending with faint whispers that sounded like fragments of words, too quiet to understand. In the chaos, I turned to see Sarah, her flashlight pointing at the gown again. But this time it was different. What had been just a folded piece of fabric now looked worn, stained, as if someone had been wearing it recently. My heart hammered in my chest as I took a step back, unable to look away. And then I saw it, a faint, shadowy figure standing just beyond the beam of my flashlight. It was barely there, an outline, hazy and indistinct, like a memory of someone rather than a real person. I blinked, hoping it was just a trick of the light, but the figure remained, its form twisting as it slowly moved toward us. The shape was small, childlike, with empty eyes that seemed to sink into darkness. "Please leave us alone," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her words, and for a moment it almost looked sad. But then, without warning, the shadows shifted, and the figure vanished, leaving us alone in the stifling silence of the records room. The whispers died down, and the giggling stopped, leaving only our heavy, panicked breathing filling the air. A click sounded behind us, and the door to the records room slowly creaked open on its own. We didn't hesitate. We scrambled out into the hallway, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness of that room. But as we stood in the dim corridor, catching our breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital was watching, that it had let us go only because it wanted to. We glanced back at the records room, and I shivered as I saw the gown lying on the floor, no longer neatly folded. It looked as though someone had just stepped out of it, leaving it crumpled and discarded, like a skin shed by something no longer human. As we stumbled out of the records room, the silence in the hallway felt even more suffocating than before. Each step echoed down the seemingly endless corridor, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to deepen with every passing second. No one said a word. The events in that room had shaken us to our core, and the memory of that shadowy figure, a child's outline, so close and yet so wrong, still lingered in our minds. It felt as if a piece of the hospital had latched onto us, something unseen but undeniably there. Mark tried to lead us back the way we'd come, his flashlight flickering erratically as he swept it over every corner and crevice. But with each turn, it felt as if the layout of the hospital had changed. Hallways that should have led back toward the entrance now seemed unfamiliar, twisting into corridors we didn't recognize. Doors that were open before were now closed, their handles rusted over as if they hadn't been touched in years. "This doesn't make any sense," Mark whispered, his voice strained and barely audible. "I swear we came from this direction." I looked around, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of the maze we were trapped in. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. It felt like the entire building was closing in on us, as if the hospital itself were alive, its very structure shifting to keep us inside. Sarah clutched my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We're not supposed to be here. It's like this place is keeping us." Mike shook his head, his voice unsteady. "No, we just got turned around, that's all. We'll find a way out. We have to." But even as he said it, there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was right, though. Giving in to panic wasn't going to help us now. We pressed on, moving as a group through the twisted corridors, desperately searching for any sign of the exit. The air grew colder, carrying a dampness that clung to our skin and filled our lungs with the scent of mildew and rot. As we rounded another corner, we found ourselves standing before a door marked intensive care. It was slightly ajar, and from within, we could see faint flickering light. None of us wanted to go inside, but it felt as though we had no choice, like some unseen force was pulling us forward. Mark pushed the door open, and we stepped into the room, our flashlights cutting through the dim, eerie glow. The intensive care unit was small, with just a few beds arranged in a row. The machines that once surrounded them were broken and rusted, their screens shattered and buttons missing. But the beds themselves, they were pristine. Each one was neatly made, the sheets smooth and unwrinkled, as if waiting for patients that would never come. In the far corner, a single light bulb flickered above a small, makeshift shrine. An array of old, faded photographs and candles melted down to mere stubs. The photos were of patients, their faces blurred and faded, their expressions haunted. Some of the images looked decades old, while others seemed disturbingly recent. It was as if time didn't follow the same rules here, as though the hospital existed in a place where past and present were intertwined. I moved closer to the shrine, compelled by a strange, morbid curiosity. The photos weren't just of patients. There were doctors, nurses, even what appeared to be visitors. They all had the same hollow, lifeless eyes, as if the hospital had drained the very essence from them, leaving only empty shells. And then I saw it, a photograph that made my blood run cold. It was of a small group of people standing just outside the hospital entrance, looking young and carefree, their faces full of excitement and curiosity. I recognized them instantly. It was us. The image was black and white, grainy, but unmistakably us, standing there just as we had when we arrived. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the photo, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. I felt Sarah's hand tighten on my arm, and when I turned to look at her, I saw that she'd noticed the photo too. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. How is that possible?" she whispered. Mark took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. This has to be some kind of sick joke. Someone must have put that there to mess with us." But even as he spoke, the flickering light intensified, casting strange, shifting shadows across the room. The air grew thick, almost oppressive, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It was as if we were intruding on something ancient and angry, something that had been waiting, watching, and now, we'd finally crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Just then, a soft hum filled the air, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. It was the hum of machines, but not the broken, rusted ones scattered around the room. These were machines that shouldn't have been running, their wires frayed, their screens dark. Yet the sound grew louder, pulsing like a heartbeat, filling the room with an eerie, mechanical life. Suddenly, one of the beds began to shake, the sheets rippling as if something invisible were lying beneath them. We froze, watching in horror as the bed rattled violently, its legs scraping against the floor. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped, leaving the room deathly silent once more. We stood there, paralyzed, each of us struggling to process what we'd just witnessed. The air felt thick with the weight of something unseen, something that had been awakened by our presence. It was as if the hospital itself were alive, feeding off our fear, growing stronger with every passing second. I looked back at the shrine, at the photographs of those who had come before us, and a terrifying thought gripped my mind. This place didn't just trap people. It absorbed them, took pieces of their souls, and left them as empty shells, trapped in photos, in memories, in shadows that wandered the halls, waiting for new visitors to claim. Mark seemed to snap out of his daze, grabbing my arm. "We need to get out of here. Now!" We turned, racing back toward the door, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls as we fled the intensive care unit. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital was watching, that it was amused, savoring our terror. We could leave the room, but we couldn't escape the hospital. It had us, and it wasn't going to let go easily. We ran through the darkened hallways, our footsteps echoing, quick and frantic, as if the sound alone could keep whatever haunted this place at bay. But with each step, the air felt heavier, thicker, as though we were pushing through a dense fog that wasn't really there. The hospital had taken on a life of its own, shifting and twisting around us, warping the path back to the entrance. Mark led the way, his flashlight bobbing up and down in the darkness, casting shadows that seemed to dance and flicker, twisting into strange, unsettling shapes. Sarah and Mike were right behind him, clutching each other, while I brought up the rear, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see the shadowy figure of the child from the records room, or worse, one of the empty-eyed faces from the shrine in the intensive care unit. But the hallways were empty, stretching out before us like a labyrinth with no end. The hospital felt endless, its corridors looping back on themselves in impossible ways. We passed rooms and doors we swore we hadn't seen before. Some were operating rooms filled with rusted surgical tools, others empty patient rooms with beds stripped bare, as if waiting for new occupants. Mike stumbled to a halt, his breathing ragged, eyes wide with fear. This can't be happening. We've gone in circles. We're trapped here. This place is not right. It's like it's alive. Mark turned to face him, trying to mask his own fear. We have to keep moving. Standing around won't help us. There has to be a way out. But his voice was thin, laced with doubt, and I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew as well as I did that we weren't in control here. The hospital was leading us, guiding us deeper into its twisted heart. We pressed on, moving slower now, our fear giving way to a strange, grim determination. The hospital was testing us, pushing us to our limits, but we refused to give in. With each step, I felt as though we were descending into something dark and terrible, a place where time and reality no longer held sway. The air grew colder, and a strange, metallic smell filled the hallways, mixing with the musty scent of decay. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon a stairwell leading down. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint, pulsing light emanated from the darkness below. No one wanted to go down there, but it was the first new path we'd found in what felt like an eternity, and something about it drew us in, compelling us to descend. It was as if the hospital were inviting us deeper, daring us to face whatever lay hidden in its depths. Mark led the way, his flashlight barely penetrating the thick darkness that filled the stairwell. Each step creaked and groaned beneath our weight, and the sound echoed off the walls, amplifying the tension that had taken root in our minds. The light grew stronger as we descended, casting an eerie, unnatural glow that seemed to seep into the very walls. The metallic smell intensified, and I could taste it on my tongue, sharp and bitter. The stairwell led us to a basement corridor lined with doors, each one marked with faded, illegible signs. The walls here were different, covered in peeling paint that seemed to pulsate in time with a faint hum filling the air. It was as if the building itself were breathing, alive and aware of our presence. Sarah clung to Mark's arm, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darting from one door to the next as if she could sense something lurking just beyond them. As we moved down the hallway, I noticed a door at the far end that seemed newer than the others, its surface free of dust and decay. A soft light spilled out from beneath it, casting a dim glow that beckoned us forward. We approached cautiously, each of us feeling a strange pull, an irresistible urge to see what lay behind that door. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle, and for a moment, I thought he might back out. But then he took a deep breath, steeling himself, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobic, and bathed in an unnatural, sickly yellow light that seemed to come from nowhere. In the center of the room stood an old hospital bed, pristine and white, with a single, thin figure lying motionless beneath the sheets. The sight of it sent a chill through my body, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run. But something held me there, rooted to the spot, unable to look away. The figure on the bed was a child, no older than 6 or 7, with pale skin and sunken eyes that stared blankly at the ceiling. Its face was expressionless, empty, as if it were merely a shell, devoid of any spark of life. But then, as we watched, its head slowly turned, its hollow eyes fixing on us, as if it had been waiting, watching, anticipating our arrival. A low, whispering sound filled the room, the same soft giggle we'd heard before, but this time it was closer, more menacing. The child's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I felt them all the same, an icy dread spreading through my body, as if those silent words were being whispered directly into my mind. Who are you?" Sarah stammered, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes wide with terror. The child didn't answer, but its gaze seemed to sharpen, its eyes filling with a strange, ancient malice that sent shivers down my spine. It was as if we were staring into something far older and more powerful than any of us could comprehend, something that had been waiting in the darkness, feeding off the fear and pain trapped within these walls. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving only an empty bed and the faint scent of decay lingering in the air. We stood there, stunned, struggling to process what we'd just seen. The room felt colder, emptier, as though a part of the hospital itself had slipped away, taking a piece of us with it. Mark took a shaky step back, his face pale and drawn. We need to go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Now." We didn't argue. Turning, we fled the room, racing back down the hallway, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness that seemed to close in around us. But as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hospital wasn't finished with us yet, that it had shown us only a glimpse of the horror that lay within its walls. The hospital wanted us to know its secrets, to feel the weight of the pain and suffering it had witnessed, and it wasn't going to let us go without a final test. We tore down the hallway, our footsteps pounding in sync, driven by a single, desperate thought: escape. The hospital had shown us glimpses of its past, pieces of a nightmare that felt more real than anything we'd ever known. Now, it was as if the very walls were alive, closing in around us, determined to keep us within its twisted embrace. Every corridor we ran down seemed to lead us deeper, looping back into itself in ways that defied logic. Mark led the way, his eyes wide with fear, no longer the confident explorer who had brought us here. He was as desperate as the rest of us, but he pushed forward, dragging us with him through the twisting labyrinth. The oppressive silence was gone now, replaced by a constant, low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It resonated through the walls, vibrating in our bones, growing louder with each step. Occasionally, I thought I heard voices, faint whispers that slipped in and out of the hum, calling our names, pleading, laughing. The voices were maddening, like fragments of broken memories trapped within the building itself. We turned another corner, and suddenly, there was the entrance door. It was exactly as we'd left it, standing slightly ajar, bathed in the dim glow of a street lamp outside. Relief flooded through me, and I almost cried out in joy. We were going to make it out. This nightmare was nearly over. But just as we reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the hum stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, absolute. Mark grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if the hospital itself were holding the door shut, its invisible grip tightening with every second. No, this isn't happening," Mark muttered, his voice breaking. He pounded on the door, kicking it in frustration, but it was useless. We were trapped. Then, from behind us, came the soft sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving closer with each passing second. I turned, dread pooling in my stomach, and saw a figure emerging from the shadows at the end of the hallway. It was the same childlike figure from the records room, but now it was more solid, more real, its empty eyes fixed on us with a cold, unblinking stare. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and methodical, as if savoring our fear. I felt rooted to the spot, my limbs heavy, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was something ancient in those hollow eyes, a malice that defied words. It was the embodiment of every horror that had ever taken place within these walls, the collective suffering of countless souls, and it was focused entirely on us. Please let us go," Sarah whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. But the figure showed no sign of mercy. It continued its relentless approach, its gaze piercing through us, stripping away any semblance of hope. Mark let out a strangled cry, his fear finally boiling over. He turned, ramming his shoulder into the door with all his strength. The door shuddered but didn't give way. He tried again and again, desperation fueling him, until, at last, we heard the wood crack. With one final, desperate push, the door burst open, and we stumbled outside, falling onto the cold, hard ground. The moment we crossed the threshold, the humming stopped, and the silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. I looked back at the hospital, expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway, watching us. But the entrance was empty, the hallway beyond dark and silent, as if it had swallowed the horrors we'd witnessed, leaving only a cold, hollow shell. We staggered to our feet, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. No one said a word. We simply stared at the hospital, the reality of what we'd experienced sinking in. The building loomed before us, silent and indifferent, as though nothing had happened, as though we hadn't come face to face with something that defied understanding. Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling. Did that really just happen? Mark nodded, his face pale, his eyes haunted. "We need to go," he muttered. "We need to leave. Now." Without another word, we turned and walked away, our footsteps echoing in the quiet night. As we moved further from the hospital, I felt a strange sensation, like a weight lifting from my chest. But there was something else too, a nagging sense that we hadn't truly escaped, that a part of us was still trapped within those walls, left behind with the shadows and the whispers. When I looked back one last time, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in one of the broken windows on the top floor, was a shadow, a small, childlike figure watching us, its hollow eyes staring unblinking, as if it were waiting for our return. We never spoke of that night again, and none of us ever went back. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that hum again, faint and distant, like an echo of something long forgotten. And I know, deep down, that the hospital still remembers us, that it's waiting, and that someday it might call us back.